Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature, the North American Beaver, a damn fine webinar presented by NatHab Expedition Leader Drew McCarthy. It's a pleasure as always, Drew. I'm going to hand things off to you.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Kendall. It's a pleasure to be here again. And thanks everybody for joining me today. Thanks to Natural Habitat for hosting this webinar. Today I'll be presenting on the North American beaver. And I thought about calling this program, America's most talented North American aquatic mammal, or, an ecosystem engineer. But I just thought, a damn fine webinar just sounded a lot better. So I went for it. Today I'm presenting from Teutonia, Idaho, my home. And Teutonia is actually kind of a unique place to be discussing beavers, because beavers and trapping is a big part of the history of this part of the Mountain West. So I'm just on the very southwest corner of Yellowstone, within the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. And I live in what's called the Teton Valley. And in the past, this area was called Pierre's Hole. And Pierre was a Hudson Bay Trading Company trader who was of Iroquois descent. And one of the largest rendezvous or gatherings for trading furs and pelts to ever happen in the Mountain West happened here in Pierre's Hole in 1832. So the subject of beavers, the subject of the ecology relating to beavers and the history of beaver trapping is something that is an integral part of my home here in Teutonia, Idaho. So I'll start with a little bit of an introduction to myself. Again, my name's Drew McCarthy. I'm actually from Anchorage, Alaska originally, but I've been living in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. I've been living in Teutonia, Idaho since 2015. I've been working down here for a lot longer, though. I first started leading trips in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem around 2010. I'm from Anchorage, Alaska. I studied geology at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. Later on, I got my master's in education from the University of Alaska Anchorage. I started guiding in 2007. And for Natural Habitat, I lead trips in Greenland. I lead trips in Yellowstone, both in the summer and the winter. I also lead trips in Alaska. So I'm around different areas where there's a lot of beaver habitat. I spent some time after college working as a geologist for the state of Alaska. I studied volcanoes out in the Aleutian Islands, and mostly that work was involved in producing hazard analysis maps. So we were looking at what were the hazards associated with those Aleutian volcanoes. I've spent some time working for the National Park Service as an environmental planner based in Anchorage, Alaska. I also have taught. I've taught in middle school classrooms, although I've never really been a formal paid classroom teacher. I did all my teaching as a student teacher. So the majority of the teaching that I do is as a guide out in the field with guests like those depicted here in this photo. This picture was taken last fall in Yellowstone. And then the picture of me staying by the river, that's also taken last fall on the banks of the Yellowstone River. And I want to, as I'm leading trips in Yellowstone, I'm always thinking about the landscape around me, and I'm always sort of observing how the park developed, how the roadways developed. And I think one of the more interesting things that's popped out in my time in Yellowstone is how all the roadways tend to follow the river corridors. Now, there's reasons for that, and it kind of goes all the way back to when those first trails were forged through the area that is today Yellowstone. Many of those trails were first forged by animals. They were animal trails. And then humans began using those trails. Eventually, people began riding on those trails in horseback, and those trails got bigger. Fast forward to more recent time, Yellowstone's road systems are essentially trails that were started in many cases by animals. Animals tend to follow river courses. So like this picture of me standing by the Yellowstone River, the roadways in Yellowstone are almost always near waterways. So we're always in the habitat of the North American beaver. So it's a subject that over the years I've really enjoyed learning more about. Now, my first guiding work was done in Alaska. I started guiding in 2007, and I actually drove buses along the Denali Park Road for 13 seasons. That's a lot of trips across that 90-mile road. Thousands of narrated vehicle trips. along that 90-mile road through a mixture of different habitats and variety of different ecosystems. So when you drive that Denali Park Road, a lot of it is over these high mountain passes with vast expansive views of incredible scenery and hopefully a chance to see a grizzly bear, maybe some distant caribou. But you know, the last 20 miles or so of the road, you leave that high alpine terrain, the landscape flattens out, and it's really kind of hard to see wildlife sometimes. In fact, the last 20 miles of the trip, as a driver of these vehicles narrating these trips, you kind of wonder what the heck to talk about sometimes. But over the years, driving those trips, there's a lot of beaver ponds, there's a lot of glacial lakes, and there's a ton of beaver activity. And I really found that I could spend a lot of time talking about beavers, even from viewing them through the windows of a bus. So that was where my first interest in beavers really began to grow, and I sort of expanded sort of my repertoire of information about beavers and about their interactions with the landscape and interactions with the roadway itself. And I remember it must have been, I think, maybe 2012. I came back in the spring, ready to have a season, excited to give my bit about beavers, and all the beavers along that stretch of the road had disappeared. It was like the rapture of the beavers had occurred, and they all, boom, were gone. And it was a really interesting thing that really kind of enforced to me how intimately connected beavers are to weather and landscape. So what had happened was the winter previous, they had had very little snowfall in interior Alaska, but it had really cold temperatures. Now, the beaver habitat in that area was kind of suboptimal to begin with. The winter was so cold that those lakes froze, the beaver ponds froze almost all the way to the bed of the pond, making it impossible for the beavers to access their food. They all died. They all died. There wasn't a beaver that could be found, that I could see at least, for many square miles. Now, over the years since 2012, they've gradually began to return as beavers disperse back into those lakes. So that's some background as to why I first got interested in talking about North America's largest rodent. So here he is, Castor canadensis, the beaver. A little bit of discussion about the Latin name. Castor is simply the Greek name for beaver. Canadensis, of course, refers to its range in North America. Now, this beaver is independent from the European beaver. I'll talk more about that in a moment. So just some quick background about beavers. They are the largest North American rodent. They can be between 40 and 70 pounds, and they can live 10 to 15 years. So they can be quite long-lived. One thing about beavers is that they actually keep growing throughout their life. So they can get to be almost 100 pounds, a beaver on the older edge of its lifespan. These are very successful animals, but they're dependent on forested areas, or at least areas with some woody vegetation. We'll get into more of that in a minute. But you don't find beavers in the high Arctic. You don't find beavers in more lower latitudes of North America because the habitat's just not appropriate for them. Now, these animals, besides human, they have probably the biggest impact on the environment of any other animal. So they actively alter and modify their environment to suit their needs. So in some ways, they have a lot of similarities to humans. I want to mention that prior to European settlement in North America, they figure there were 200 million beavers in the area that occupies now Canada and the lower 48. So, you know, whenever I do my welcome presentations for Yellowstone trips, I talk about the bison, how they were, you know, potentially 80 million bison in North America. Well, imagine the impact of 200 million beavers on the landscape prior to European settlement. So each of these beavers making their own beaver dam, their own beaver pond, their own wetland, their own thicket would have had a dramatic impact on the environment of North America. They figure that 1/10 of the total land area of what is today the US would have been a wetland as a result of beaver activity. That equates to 300,000 square miles of wetland in pre-Columbian America. Incredible to think about the impacts that that animal had on the landscape, and it still has a lot of impact today. Just mention again that these animals are herbivores. They eat woody material, but they also eat aquatic plants. They eat grasses and they eat sedges. And finally, last thing, just basic introduction on beavers. I want to mention that these are an animal that are really considered a keystone species. And essentially what that means is that it's a species that many other members of the ecosystem depend on that species for their existence. Without the activity of a keystone species, many of the other animals within that ecosystem fail to thrive. So this image simply shows you the range of the two contemporary modern beaver species. So the blue is the North American beaver. The red is the European beaver. There's no political affiliation, it's just the random choice of colors. I do want to mention that ancestral rodents actually started in North America, and this was about 33 million years ago. And so they would have traveled across the Bering Land Bridge into Europe. But then during the Miocene, about 8 million years ago, that's when the modern day members of the castor genus, the relatives of the beaver, traveled back across the Bering Land Bridge out of Europe into North America. A bird just hit the window, unfortunately, but it looks like it's fine. So the European beaver and the North American beaver are quite similar. This picture here in the lower right is a European beaver. Some of the differences between the European beavers have a slightly more elongated skull. They have kind of a triangular opening to their nasal cavity in their skull. They have lighter fur, although this picture doesn't really indicate that well. They have a narrower tail. So one of the most important features of a beaver is its flattened tail. We'll talk more about that. The European beaver has a narrower tail. Now, these animals were quite abundant in Russia, in Central Europe and Northern Europe, even into the Middle East and Central Asia. But their numbers were greatly reduced as a result of the fur trade in Europe, particularly the beavers in Russia were nearly decimated as a result of that fur trade. Now, some European countries are actively and aggressively reintroducing the European beaver. It's by no means extinct, but its numbers were pretty drastically declined as a result of trapping. One thing I'll say about the European beaver, it used to be thought that they were actually the same species as the North American beaver. In the 70s, there was enough sophisticated genetic analysis to essentially discover that North American beavers have fewer chromosomes than European beavers. So as a result, they can't interbreed. They are actually a distinct species. The other thing about European beavers, which is pretty interesting, is they don't actually make dams. So one of the behaviors that beaver are so famous for is the construction of dams and lodges, the modifications to their environment that I alluded to before. European beavers, of course, they need water, but they don't build dams, they don't build lodges. Now, beavers are members of the suborder Castomorpha, and surprisingly, other orders of that, other members of that order include kangaroo rats, kangaroo mice, pocket mice, and gophers. So those are all close relatives to the beaver. Now, another relative to the beaver, but not quite as close, is the capybara. Now, this is a picture of the capybara. It is so the North American beaver is a huge rodent, but the capybara is by far the biggest. And it's actually not in the same genus as a beaver. It's not in the castor family, but it has a lot of similarities in lifestyle. So it's another semi-aquatic animal, meaning that it doesn't depend fully on water, but it does need water to live out its life history. Now, I want to just point out that these animals are South American, and South America actually has a really high diversity of different rodent niches being filled. So it's kind of interesting that capybara, some of you may know, it lives a life very, very similar to a hippo in Africa. So they live at very similar latitudes, but in South America, there aren't hippos, but there are a lot of similar environments to wetland environments to where hippos live in Africa. As a result, rodents filled that niche and convergent evolution occurred, and the capybara lives a life and fills an ecological niche almost identical to a hippopotamus. in South America. But we got a little bit far away from where we were, our topic here. We want to get ourselves back to beavers. So here's a great photo of the North American beaver as opposed to the European. A couple things to point out first. Again, this is the second largest rodent in the world after the capybara. Notice it's got kind of a streamlined body. It has webbed hind feet and semi-webbed front feet. It has a shape that is somewhat similar to other aquatic mammals. So it does look even a little seal-like, as it's got the similar adaptations to living in the water to other semi-aquatic mammals. I want to point out in particular, it's very shiny chestnut brown fur. This fur is one of the most precise and specialized adaptations that the beaver has to living in the northern hemisphere and the more northerly climates. So that fur, when the beaver's underwater, it traps air against the skin of the beaver. So in combination of the fat that the beaver has under its skin, it's subcutaneous fat, that layer of trapped air keeps this animal incredibly warm when diving into colder waters. Now, beavers are always found near water. So again, I've emphasized that they're semi-aquatic, they're dependent on water, but they don't stay in water all the time. They can, on a regular basis, make forays away from ponds or rivers of up to 100 yards. In the case of a juvenile that's dispersing, and we'll talk more about the life history and the juvenile, the family sort of history of beavers toward the end of the presentation, but juveniles can distribute for hundreds of miles from where they're born. So I remember once I was hiking in Alaska close to a glacier near Golconda, and I was right on the edge of this glacier, and there was cold water flowing, and there was nothing but rocks, and there was blue ice. And this beaver makes its way down the river course, leaving its wet footprints from dry rock to dry rock. What was that beaver doing next to a glacier? Well, it was a juvenile that was dispersing. So they can spend time away from water in order to disperse. Now, their real trick with water for beavers is how they modify the environment to essentially use the water to their advantage. So they're going to be creating dams, they're going to be creating ponds that are deep enough to not freeze year round. That's really important. And I mentioned my experience with beavers in Denali, how if the ponds do freeze all the way down, it can mean bad news for the beavers during the winter time. Ponds also are going to provide a measure of protection from predators, both summer and winter. So it is rare to see a beaver in the winter. Typically, they are inside their lodges. They are happy in the heat and warmth and darkness of their lodges, but they will make forays out onto the ice. Another reason why that fur is so important to the life history of a beaver. These animals can easily cruise around in -40, -50, even -60 Fahrenheit because of that thick coat. Now, they wouldn't spend much time above the ice during the winter months, but particularly in the spring, as depicted in this image, if they've run out of food and if they're stored food, then they will make forays out into the landscape. Now, that's when they're most subject to predation, particularly from wolves in this part of the world here in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. The other thing about this picture I want to point out, which is kind of interesting, is if you look at that beaver closely, it's actually not eating wood. So beavers are known for eating woody material, or the cambium specifically, that we'll talk more about as this presentation progresses. But this beaver is actually eating aquatic vegetation that it pulled up from the bottom of the river and has been consuming on the edge of the river, on the edge of the ice shelf there, as we can see. So I want to have a closer look at beaver fur. This is one of the most important things to beaver. It's one of the reasons that the fur trade had such a dramatic impact on the histories of Europeans and Native Americans both throughout the years, and we'll talk more about that. But first of all, you can see that beaver fur has a very coarse outer hair and then a very, very fine insulative inner hair that provides the insulation. That inner fur is right up against their skin, and when the beavers are underwater, it stays nearly dry because those outer guard hairs protect from moisture penetrating. And there's another tool that beavers use to help protect their coat from the water. I'll talk about that more in a second. I want to mention that per square inch, they figure there's 77,000, maybe even 100,000 hairs per square inch. So is incredibly dense hairs there. Now, beavers have always been incredibly important to humans. So modern humans and then indigenous people and ancient peoples have always found beaver fur to be incredibly useful. It's been prized for its warmth, of course, its luxurious texture, but particularly because of its longevity. It's incredibly durable. A properly tanned and prepared beaver hide and will last many, many years of heavy use without any breakdown or deterioration. So indigenous people, they primarily were trapping these animals traditionally and preparing the hides to be used in clothing, but also in use for boots, for mittens, for trim, and for jackets. This image here in the upper right is a depiction of a tool used by indigenous people in North America to prepare hides. It would have been a bone that was cut, a little bit of combing created to scrape the underside of the skin to scrape off any tissue, any fat, and prepare it for use. Now, it should also be mentioned that the trapping techniques that were used were varied. So they used snares. Indigenous people used bows and spears. Later on, and still today in some parts of the North, use steel traps and wire snares to trap beaver. Now, traditionally, the pelts were very useful, of course, but so was the meat. The meat was eaten. I've never eaten beaver myself, but my understanding is that it tastes a little bit like pork, and apparently it's very tasty and a very fatty meat. Now, if we go back over to Europe, think about ancient European trade, we can safely assume and safely report that in Europe, beaver pelts were traded for centuries. So this is something that the 8th and 9th century, there's evidence of beaver being used for trade in Central Asia, throughout Siberia, in the Scandinavian countries, very early trade item or commodity. Now, I mentioned already the European beaver was quite substantial populations throughout Northern Europe and Siberia, but during the 17th century, as a result of trade and trapping, these animals began to decline precipitously. Now, it's interesting to notice that there's really 3 products that can be derived from that beaver pelt. So one is the fur itself, so you can make a fur pelt, a jacket, whatever. 2 would be the leather or suede on the underside. That obviously has uses. 3 is probably the most interesting one, I think. It's the felting. So felting is a process where the inner, very fine underfur is removed from the pelt through a process of heat and pressure and agitation. That very sensitive fur is removed, and then it's further agitated with heat and water and other compounds to create a chunk of very pliable, warm material that we can refer to as felt. In the Roman world, felt was actually used as an inexpensive form of armor. I wouldn't imagine that it would do much in stopping an arrow, but I guess it did. It was used as protection from projectiles, but it was also used as padding underneath heavy steel armor. So products derived from beaver have been in circulation now for quite a long time. Now, due to the depletion of the European beaver, by the 1600s, nearly all exports of beaver fur from Russia had stopped. And so that kind of brings us to the North American beaver and the North American beaver trade. So unfortunately for the North American beaver, the depletion of the European beaver sort of coincided with the establishment of European colonies in North America. So English, French, the Netherlands had all established colonies in North America by the mid-17th century. Beaver from North American, beaver from the northern areas of North America had a thicker, denser, more useful fur. So the Canadian, the beaver that are in today's Canada, the beaver that were found in the northern part of North America were actually more valuable and more useful than beaver that were found in the more southern parts of North America. So these pelts were sent to Europe, and they were used primarily to make beaver pelt hats or beaver felt hats, which are depicted over on the right side of the screen here. So these were hugely popular in the 1700s and the 1800s. These hats, sort of strangely enough, played, I guess it's not strange, really, we're no different today, but these hats played a role in sort of reflecting one's social identity, what their place was in the class system, what their place was in the hierarchy. The shape and style of the hat indicated to a passerby one's profession, their wealth, their social rank, their position in society. The color, the shape, the material all carried specific meanings. So these hats were quite important and quite in style. Now, other products that were derived from beaver that were shipped back to Europe included castoreum oil. So we'll talk more about castoreum oil as this presentation continues because it's pretty fascinating. But castor oil was used as a base for perfumes. It was actually used as an additive in food. And castor oil comes from the castor glands of the beaver, and we'll talk more about that as we continue. Now, I want to talk a little bit more about kind of the unfortunate interactions between North American settlers and native indigenous people as a result of the beaver trade. So in North America, French, Dutch, and English all found ways of working with indigenous North Americans to expand access to the product that they were looking for, in this case, beaver. The sort of Native Americans, the indigenous people, had an indigenous familiarity with the area and well-developed hunting and trapping skills that the Europeans just didn't have. So it was important to develop relationships with these native groups in order to ensure a steady supply of beaver for essentially for their economy. So trade within the colony, between other colonies and within the indigenous communities, as well as with Europe, really created a pretty vibrant and powerful economy that really fed the colonial process of North America. The colonists introduced a lot to the native people, including steel tools and gunpowder and weaponry, tools that were quite useful to the indigenous population. Unfortunately, they also introduced a lot of diseases, and a variety of diseases were just incredibly devastating to the Native American indigenous peoples of North America, and then by extension, South America as well. So unfortunately, competition for access to beaver hunting areas caused warfare between these indigenous nations. Most famously, the Iroquois and the Huron had some incredibly vicious battles over beaver territory. So these indigenous European alliances entangled Native American populations in a number of European affairs and conflicts, including the French Indian War and ultimately the American Revolution. So I'm not a historian, and this is a subject that I have just skimmed the surface, but I want to transition now away a little bit from the history, as fascinating as it is, and return a little bit to the natural history of the subject here, this presentation, and revisit some of the adaptations that beavers have to their semi-aquatic existence. So this again is a North American beaver, and I want to point out a couple things in this image that are really interesting, specific adaptations that these animals have to their water environment. So first of all, there's a series of valves in their ears that when these animals dive, those valves flap shut to prevent moisture from getting in the ears. Additionally, they have what's called a nictitating membrane, which is a membrane which slides down over the eye and allows them to view, to see underwater like a pair of snorkeling goggles or swim goggles. Also, their nostrils flap shut for the same reason, to prevent the inhalation of water. Now, this beaver is holding a willow branch in its mouth. These animals have incredible lips that will close around whatever they're chewing on. They can chew, they can eat underwater without ingesting water as a result of those lips. Now, this beaver here is showing off its forelimbs, which are very human-like in some ways. Now, obviously, this picture, they don't really appear human-like, but if you watch the way beavers use them, they're incredibly dexterous with their forelimbs. So they're semi-web. They don't have a full webbing, but they can be used for holding branches. They can be used for eating. You'll see beavers eating the bark off of pieces of wood, almost like a human eats a piece of corn, of cooked corn. They're incredibly dexterous. As well, beavers will use their forelimbs for building. So when they construct their dams and lodges, those hands can literally pick up rocks, they can pick up mud, they can, with some degree of dexterity, they can carefully pack those rocks and mud in the process of constructing their dams. Lastly, those forelimbs are used for grooming. So they're going to be used to meticulously go through all that luxurious fur and keep it clean and keep it well conditioned. Here's a depiction of a beaver walking with objects in its forelimbs. Locomotion on land is typically all four, meaning that they're moving on all four of their feet. But if they are carrying material, they will walk just on their hind feet alone. Their tail actually helps them when they're walking with just their hind feet. In water, the hind legs are used for propulsion. I'll show you a picture of their hind feet in a second here. While swimming, those forelimbs are actually held close to their side. They just use their rear feet for propulsion when they're swimming. So here's a close-up picture of their rear feet, and I think this is one of the more fascinating things about beaver morphology. So, you know, obviously the webbing between their digits is used to help propel them underwater, but their claws are modified to help groom their coats. So the two innermost toes have a regular nail, but then they have this additional horny growth. Now the fur is worked through the gap, almost like a comb, and to help condition and to help groom their fur. It's absolutely incredible how specialized this particular little nail is. There's actually, you can't see it in this picture, but there's actually smaller serrations, almost like a fine-tooth comb, that help them in grooming. Now, the last thing I'll mention again is the castoreum oil. So castoreum oil, it comes from what are called castor sacs. They're located in two cavities under the skin between the pelvis and the back of the tail. And the castor sacs produce this sort of yellowish oil, which is used to help waterproof the fur. It's also used in scent marking, which I'll talk about more here in a moment. Now, the tail is one of the beaver's most ingenious adaptations. So it's this 12-inch long, 8-inch wide, flattened tail. It's bare, it's got no fur on it. It's almost reptilian in nature. The beaver potentially could lose a lot of heat through its tail in the cold water because it doesn't have any fur on it. But they have this ingenious system of circulation called countercurrent circulation, so that the warm blood from the core flows direct toward the tail, directly past the cold blood coming in from the tail. Some energy and heat is shared, and that way the beaver's tail stays cold, but it doesn't drop the temperature of the body while that animal is in cold water. The tail is used for a rudder, not for propulsion. So a muskrat, for instance, is another aquatic rodent that actually uses its tail for propulsion, but beavers don't use their tail in that way. The tail is fat storage, so it'll help the beaver survive kind of lean times. When a beaver is out of water and chewing down a larger tree in the process of making a dam or a lodge, it'll use its tail to prop against the ground and help it direct force toward the tree that it's chewing. Now, beaver tails were eaten by indigenous people. They were also eaten by the mountain men and the trappers that were in the Mountain West in the mid-1800s. I'm sure somewhere very near my house here, many beaver tails were consumed during those rendezvous and fur trapping events in the mid-1800s. But indigenous people, still to this day in parts of Alaska, eat beaver tail as a delicacy. Now the tail has another very important function, and that is warning. So beaver will do what's called a tail slap. It's completely unmistakable when you're out in the forest. You'll walk up near a pond, you'll hear that slap, indicates that a beaver has seen you and is warning the rest of the colony. So typically a beaver will dive immediately after it does that tail slap, but then it'll pop up just its eyes and nose and just watch and look and sniff and see if it can keep track of whatever it was on alarming. Other beavers respond to that slap. If a beaver is in deep water, it doesn't really do much when it hears one of those tail slaps. But if it's on land or if it's in shallow water, those beavers will launch into the pond and dive for protection. Again, the tail slap is usually something that we only see adult beavers do. It takes juveniles a little while to figure out that technique. So underwater, beavers really come into their own as aquatic or semi-aquatic mammals. They're incredibly buoyant, and particularly the young. And that probably has a lot to do with the fur that's trapped, the air that's trapped in their fur. Notice it's very streamlined, much like another marine mammal, like even a whale or a seal. There's some physiological similarities to other marine mammals. Beavers, when they dive, they shunt blood away from their skin to their core to help minimize heat loss. But more interestingly, the heartbeat and the rate and volume slows in a beaver when it's diving. It's called bradycardia. So by slowing down the heartbeat, the beaver reduces the movement of lactic acid and CO2 through its circulation. Lactic acid and CO2 are what triggers breathing, the urge to breathe in mammals. If a beaver slows its heart rate down, it's less apt to need to breathe. And so it doesn't need to come to the air come to the surface as frequently. They can dive for 8 to 15 minutes without getting air. Incredibly efficient at oxygen and CO2 exchange when they do breathe. One of the things beavers that'll do, which is really fascinating, in the winter when the ponds are covered with ice, they will exhale bubbles of air which travel to the surface and sit under the ice. That bubble of air will, over time, exchange oxygen with the water, become reoxygenated. The beaver will then return to that bubble and breathe the same air again in order to continue its dive. Absolutely incredible. So amazing. So a beaver's diet, as I mentioned, they're herbivores. They have a strictly herbaceous diet. They really love willows. So this picture here shows a willow shrub, but they also eat a lot of aspen. They eat a lot of cottonwood. They also eat aquatic vegetation, as I mentioned, during periods when food might be less available on the surface around their lakes and ponds. In the late summer and fall, beavers begin to cache food for the winter. So do this for me. Imagine that you took a leaf of willow, or rosemary for that matter, and stuck it in a glass of cold water, and then put that glass in your refrigerator. If you came back to that glass 2 weeks later, chances are that piece of willow or rosemary or whatever would still be green. So beavers are ingenious. They're collecting food resources during the summer, submerging them underwater. When the lakes freeze, they have a preserved food source under the water that they can consume. So I want to talk a little bit about willows in particular. So willows are an abundant plant species, mostly a shrub, but also trees. Now the genus of willow is Salix, and this is interesting. Most of you have heard the term salicylic acid. It's of course aspirin. Well, willows contain a lot of salicylic acid. Now, salicylic acid is a secondary plant compound that's produced to prevent herbivory. So it's bitter. If you've ever chewed an aspirin, it's incredibly bitter. That will prevent insects from eating the leaves. That might even prevent a moose from eating the leaves in some cases. So the plant evolved the salicylic acid as an anti-herbivory device, but a secondary use is that it's a pain reliever. It's just a coincidence. But castoreum oil, which is produced by the castor sacs in the beaver, was also used for medicine, a topical medicine. Because it had so much salicylic acid, it was used as a pain reliever by early people, indigenous people, and even as a product in Europe. It's a bit the same as what you've heard people talk about willow bark tea. It's the same idea as willow bark tea. It's a pain reliever. Now, beaver have incredible teeth. You know, all rodents, one of the common characteristics of rodents are incisors that grow throughout the life of the animal. So they continuously grow and they're continuously worn down. Notice the beaver, this forward surface on the tooth is this yellow-orange compound. That's enamel, but that enamel is enforced with iron. So it's an iron-tinged enamel, which makes it hard-wearing. As the animal chews throughout its life, it continuously is sharpening its incisors as they grind against each other to a chisel-like point. That allows them to decimate aspen and cottonwood trees, like this picture over to the right shows, as they're cutting down trees. Now I want to mention, it's kind of interesting to think about the use of the felling of trees for building dams and lodges is secondary to the consumption of their food source. So beavers first evolved the ability to eat the cambium, or the tissue underneath the bark of the tree. But then over time, the action of felling trees actually created a new behavior, which was this building of dams and lodges. So I have this picture of a moose, which might seem unusual in a program about beavers, but in some ways, moose have a similar way of surviving off of the cambium of trees, as do beavers. So in a moose, they're a ruminant, right? And so moose, they're going to be eating the vegetation, the bark off, and eating the cambium, which is the sugary green layer just under the bark. Now, in their rumen, they have bacteria that help break down the cellulose and help the animal survive off the cambium. Beavers are not ruminants, but they have a similar strategy. So a beaver has what's called a cecum, which is a little sac similar to our appendix. That sac is full of bacteria. The cecum and the bacteria in the cecum will break down the cellulose that the beavers eat. And then the beavers will defecate, and then they'll practice coprophage. They'll go back and they'll eat that excrement, and the second time through, they get more nutrients and vitamins from their food source than the first time through. Moose, on the other hand, don't practice coprophagy because they have a different system. They have that ruminant system. Now, the other thing that's interesting about beavers is it's not just bacteria in the cecum that help them get nutrients from the cambium, from their woody food source. It's actually bacteria throughout their entire intestine. In fact, 30% of the nutrition that they get from their cellulose diet, their cambium diet, actually is just from their intestines themselves, which is pretty amazing. That they don't need an herbivore, or they don't need they don't need a rumen, but they also don't depend on their cecum. Their intestines have enough bacteria to break down that cellulose material. I could eat all the willow bark in the world, and I sure wouldn't have any headaches, but I wouldn't get any nutrition from it. So I want to talk a little bit about dam construction. So as I've already mentioned before, beavers build dams. It's important that they have the dam because it basically is their way of accessing a food resource. So as the dams get deeper, the water expands out farther. They can get to different patches of willows. As that dam gets deeper and bigger, they can follow the food on the edges of the pond. Now, they need that pond to be deep enough not to freeze, as I've already talked about. Beaver dams can easily be 40 yards long, and they're not typically straight. They typically are arced or curved. Interestingly, the shape of the dam is kind of dictated by the instinct of the animal and the environment in which they're building the dam. I'll talk more about dam construction in a second. So beavers start by underwater in a stream. They first create a ridge of gravel on the stream bed underwater using their forelimbs. Then they'll actually push sticks into the gravel pointed upstream. Now those sticks that are embedded in the gravel will collect other sticks, and a lattice work is created that the beaver will then begin reinforcing with more smaller sticks. Eventually, they will use mud and rocks to solidify that dam. Now, as soon as the dam is completed, maintenance immediately begins. So it's not a construction process that's static at all. In fact, beavers will even remove sticks to let water out if water levels get too high. So they're constantly maintaining their dams. One thing I want to mention real quick, jumping back here, you know, one reason that beavers will abandon a pond is if they've eaten all the vegetation around the pond and they can't make the pond any bigger realistically to get to more vegetation. Once that food source is exhausted, they will eventually abandon a lodge, abandon a pond, and move on to new areas. So beavers are pretty territorial, and they can live in quite dense numbers. And so beavers are going to be constantly marking their territories. So they use the castoreum oil that I talked about for conditioning their fur. They use that for creating these scent markers as well. So what they'll do is they'll excrete some of that oil from their castor sacs, and then they'll push soil around it, and it'll get taller and taller. Other beavers within the family group will do the same, and that acts as a signpost on the perimeter of the territory. If another beaver approaches that scent marking pile, first of all, they hiss, they vocalize, they make kind of a hissing sound. Secondly, they will add their own castor oil and put more soil on top of that scent marking mound. So it's kind of this constant arms race between areas where there's many adjoining or abutting beaver colonies. So I listen to a lot of NPR, and there was a story recently about this woman on TikTok who was rehabilitating a beaver in her home. Her name is Nancy Cognier, and she's lives in New York's Hudson Valley. And she calls this juvenile beaver that she keeps in her home the Beav. And I'm just going to play for you this video, and it has some relevance to a subject that I'll finish up with here.
We got a pretty good dam going today. Using this wood, but if you, I'm going to beat him to it. This is the dam he's been building. So we got a little bit of everything in there today. This is his new favorite spot for dam building. He usually does it bathrooms, bedrooms, and then now it's in front of the front door. He's liking this area for some reason.
So I just thought that was hilarious. First of all, I'd never even used TikTok before, but secondly, this woman, she wants to emphasize that Beav is not a pet, as she indicates on the screen, but she's helping to rehabilitate this beaver in her home. But it brings up this question: is dam building an instinct, or is it sort of a process of architecture, of planning? And I'll just really quickly talk a little bit about some research that was done that really suggested it was primarily instinct. Imagine some researchers putting a speaker in the center of a room with a beaver, and that speaker was playing the sound of rushing water. So the beavers would naturally respond to that sound by taking objects in the room and covering that sound. So that suggests that it's an innate response, that beavers are simply responding to the sound of rushing water. But you know, behaviorists over the years have observed that beavers also will remove rocks and sticks from their dam and will actively manage the water level in their pond depending on conditions, which is not simply a product of the sound of the rushing water. It's another instinct, or it's another aspect of behavior which is contrary to the theory of instinct. So in actuality, it's both. You know, beavers act by instinct to build dams, but they also are removing material in a more calculated fashion. So I want to talk a little bit about lodges to finish up here. Lodges they begin to build lodges in the late summer and fall. They start by building a platform underwater, and then they enlarge that platform until it's big enough that they can create a hollow, a cavity. Usually there's 1 or 2 rooms within that hollow, and those rooms are used for sleeping, they're used for eating. There's an open space at the top which allows for air to get in the lodge, and that's where the beavers are going to spend their summer and their winter. But in the winter, they're going to be there a lot more frequently. There's generally 2 entrances and exits, and that can be critical. Predators like river otters can try to get in those lodges, and they can escape out their exit. Now in the winter, that beaver lodge becomes an impenetrable solid mound. Bears can't dig in it. Wolves can't dig in it. But the danger is in the winter, as I mentioned, if the ponds freeze too deep, then the beavers get trapped in their lodges and they can't get to their food and they perish. But what an incredible hideaway for the winter months. You can see in this picture, the steam is rising from the vent hole in the beaver lodge in the winter, indicating the number of animals that are likely inside. And this just illustrates how the beavers are moving under the water during the winter to collect the food caches that they have put up during the late summer and fall. Also mention that beaver, they do tend to get bigger and fattier in the winter because they're so inactive, but they're eating that vegetation that they've stored under the ponds. All right, so I want to finish up here talking a little bit about the family life of beavers. So there can be 3 generations in a given lodge at one time. And the family's activities is centered around the lodge itself. So there can be 4 to 8 individuals in a beaver lodge, sometimes more. Beavers mate for life. They're monogamous. The female is in charge of the colony and she establishes the home site. 3 to 4 beavers are born fully active, fully covered in fur. They're considered precocial. They don't need to fur up after they're born. These kits are incredibly buoyant, so they just sort of pop up and float on the water. The mother will swim underneath them and lift them up and drop them back down again. After their 2nd or 3rd spring, the juveniles will disperse, looking for their own new pond and a mate, but they can return to their natal colony if they're unsuccessful in finding a new adequate resources and a new mate. So I have a couple pictures here. I just want to show aerial photos of beaver lodges and dams. Here you can see the lodge in the center and these two dams. And here you can see the stream course that's been dammed up. Now, these wetlands are incredibly important for the environment. So whether it be frogs or migratory birds or moose or fish, these animals are creating a huge amount of habitat that other animals depend on. Also, they impound water. So in dry areas like the Mountain West or in the more arid West, these are incredibly important water reservoirs to benefit the ecosystem. This is a really interesting picture from Saskatchewan, Canada. You can see the density of different beaver lodges and dams as a result of good habitat that can support many beavers. So I want to finish up by just talking about conflict. Beavers are rodents and they do reproduce quickly. And so, as a result of all the trapping that went on here as European settlement moved into North America, beaver populations were incredibly low. But in the 1940s, they began reintroducing them and they have done so well. Beavers have just flourished. They can cause problems. They can flood houses, they can flood fields, they can cause damage to roads. There's constant battles you hear about of people coming out during the day and tearing down beaver dams, and then at night they rebuild them. But I feel like this conflict really shows that beavers are doing quite well and that they're recovering incredibly well. In fact, even though they don't come close to the numbers that they were in pre-Columbian times, they're very well established back in North America now. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and other federal agencies actually build false beaver dams in some restoration areas in order to sort of reproduce the benefits of the beaver activities. Beaver, kind of like our own efforts, they dramatically change their environment. They change the ecological landscape in North America. But beavers really do it in a way that enriches the environment and really is a benefit to ecosystems that it surrounds. So I want to finish up just to leave a little time for questions and leave it on that issue of conflict.
Okay, thank you so much, Drew. We've got some good questions for you, and I just want to remind everyone who's watching, if you have questions for Drew, you can submit those in your control panel under the questions field. Okay, quite a few people were wondering why there was a little pocket of North American beaver in Europe.
Oh, you know, there could have been some introduction efforts, you know, as part of the reintroduction and the reestablishment of the European beaver and the activities surrounding beaver trade in Europe. Some North American beaver were likely reintroduced, but I don't have an answer that's beyond conjecture.
Okay. And people were curious about European beavers and why their behavior differs from North American in terms of building dams or lodges. What do they do instead?
Well, you know that the return of beavers to North America about 8 million years ago, you know, likely those beaver that crossed the Bering Land Bridge back into North America did not have that ability to build dams and build lodges, but there's more landscape that's higher latitudes in North America than in Europe. So the thought is that one of the reasons that beaver developed that activity of building beaver dams and lodges is that they were able to extend farther up into northern latitudes, especially as the ice ages ended. And so that tendency to build dams and lodges probably was a result of them being in somewhat colder areas and allowing them to utilize those colder environments.
Okay. What's the beaver's temperament normally like?
You know, they're pretty, I mean, they can be aggressive to predators, particularly if they're protecting their young, but they're pretty passive to people. You know, I've encountered a lot of beaver ponds and been canoeing and encountered beavers, and beyond that tail slap, they're pretty passive when it comes to encroachment from humans, but they can be aggressive if, you know, something tries to eat them, like a wolf or a wolverine.
And you mentioned something about river otters and beavers. Do the otters ever attack and eat the beavers?
They absolutely do. You know, for the most part, the beaver lodge is an incredibly solid defense against predation, particularly in the winter months. The exception, though, is the otter. Otters can pursue beaver into their lodges and can eat them in their lodges. I've even heard stories of otters entering into lodges and then waiting for the beaver to return and sort of hijacking the beaver when it returns to its lodge. So otters are pretty effective predators in the water, and that includes predating on beaver.
Oh yeah, that's amazing. And while we're on that subject of otters, people are really curious as to the fur and how similar it is to a beaver's fur.
You know, it's a very interesting point because, you know, otter are one of the few animals that actually exceeds a beaver's ability or a beaver's capacity of incredibly dense number of hairs per square inch. So otters actually have a beaver beat in terms of insulation quality and density of fur. They are even more insulative than beaver fur.
And some people want to know about how much vegetation they need to eat each day and if that will differ in the winter and if they ever eat fish.
They don't eat fish. They're strictly herbaceous, so they're only eating plant material. It's really going to depend on the activity of a given beaver. So at lower latitudes, they could get away with eating a little less in the winter. At higher latitudes, where the temperature is cooler, they're going to have greater energetic demands and they'll have to eat more. In my research, I did actually find a number. I think it was about, you know, I don't have the number of total pounds per year that a beaver typically consumes, but I did encounter that, and it was, you know, thousands and thousands of pounds. I think it might have been like 200 tons or something, but I can't say for sure.
Okay. There's a question here that they're asking whether you can address a little bit about the legalities in place about trapping or fur trade in North America or Europe, and any legalities involving humans altering a beaver dam?
Well, you know, among indigenous communities in Alaska, it is legal to trap beaver. So, you know, within Alaska, there's a variety of different land designations. There's land that's been set aside specifically for Native people. And then there's land that's state land. And then there's land that's federal land, often national parks or wildlife refuges. The regulations are going to differ depending on those land areas. On state land and on Native corporation land, trapping is much less regulated than on federal land. As far as conflicts relating to alteration of structures like dams and lodges, that's going to vary considerably depending on jurisdiction. So you wouldn't be able to get away with that, obviously, in any sort of wildlife refuge or national park. And many state parklands, that would not be allowed. But local and municipal jurisdictions, it's going to vary by jurisdiction.
Okay. And what is the average lifespan of a beaver in the wild?
So 10 to 15 years. They can live for a decent amount of time, surprisingly long. And it's worth noting that, you know, they do continue to grow throughout the course of their life. So as I mentioned in my introduction, you know, a beaver can be, you know, a 15-year-old beaver is quite large. They can be close to 100 pounds. It's interesting also to note that there is fossil evidence of a beaver that was in North America during the Pleistocene that was a giant beaver, you know, 10, 15 times the size of a modern North American beaver that roamed the landscape prior to our modern beavers emerging.
And how far will juveniles migrate to establish their own territory?
You know, there was one observation that was made in Alaska, and I'm just going to find it here. I want to say they observed a dispersing beaver 320 miles from its natal lodge, which again is just amazing considering that they are most subject to predation when they're out of water. So to travel 320 miles across through open forest or through open tundra would be quite a dangerous undertaking. But hey, they're looking for habitat and they're looking for a mate, so they can travel quite far.
Wow, yeah. And how close are beaver colonies to one another typically?
Well, it's really going to depend on the habitat, and typically it's going to be latitude related. So this image here, this is an area where they're quite densely packed. I'd say these must be 40 yards, 40 to 50 yard length of the dams depicted here in this image. This must be an area where there's plenty of resources and longer summers, plenty of time for vegetation to grow and to regrow and to be stored by those beavers during the winter months. You know, you get to an area like Denali where I used to work, that's really subarctic. And there, beavers are really on the cutting edge. So those beaver ponds have to be quite dispersed, five, maybe 10 miles apart. And they have to, and they're right on the edge. You know, a hard winter can decimate the entire population.
Okay. And I've got a couple questions here that are kind of similar, so I'm going to combine them for you. So when cutting down a tree, do beavers work together, or is it just one beaver per tree? And also, when they're building dams, is it a cooperative venture, or is it just one beaver that builds a dam?
So dam building and lodge building and maintenance is very much a cooperative undertaking. So the family group will work together. The juveniles they're like apprentice dam builders. They'll work with their parents and learn the craft, not to anthropomorphize, but they'll work cooperatively. As far as tree cutting goes, I've only ever observed a single beaver cutting a tree. They will work on trees in stages. So they might return to a particularly big tree, work on it day after day. They're really expert loggers, but it should be noted that they do not have the control over which direction the tree falls that a human logger might have. So it's not uncommon to be hiking or be in a canoe and see the carcass of a beaver on a stream bank or a lake shore that's actually, been crushed by a tree that it was cutting down.
Okay. And I'm going to end on a couple questions about the young. What is the gestation period of a beaver, and how many babies do they typically have per pregnancy? Also, how much do the babies weigh, and how long do the young stay with the adults?
So, so typically 3 or 4 beavers are born, and they stay with their parents for about 2 to 3 years. After the 2nd or 3rd spring, that's when they undergo that dangerous process of dispersal. I don't have a weight, a birth weight for a juvenile beaver, but they're not, with 3 to 4. I'd imagine they're less than a pound, maybe a couple pounds each when born.
Okay, great. Well, Drew, this was really interesting. People absolutely loved it, and some people actually want to hear more about the beaver, so we may have to get you to do a part 2. I'm going to turn it back over to you for closing comments.
Well, it's great to hear that there's so much interest, and an hour always ends up feeling a bit compressed to really cover the amount of information that there is to discuss with beavers. Such an incredibly wide topic. The subject relating to the indigenous people and their uses of beaver and their interaction with Europeans as they came west could be a program in its own as well. But I want to thank everybody for their patience in running through this material rather quickly. And I also want to note that it's been almost a year since I did my first webinar as part of the Daily Dose series. And it's so much fun to do these. So I really thank everybody for their participation and their really great questions.
Well, thanks again, Drew. And I'd also like to thank everyone who tuned in today. Be sure to join us on Tuesday for our next Daily Dose of Nature. Our office is closed on Monday, so we will not have a webinar on Monday. You can check out our website for next week's lineup and keep an eye out for our Sunday e-news announcement as well. We did record today's presentation, and we'll have a replay available on our website soon. And with that, I will conclude the webinar. Goodbye, everybody.